Hi, it's Nahanni Rouse. Welcome back to Can We Talk, the podcast of the Jewish Women's Archive, where gender, history, and Jewish culture meet. Danielle and Galeet Dardashti grew up in a very musical family. They had a family band, their mother was a folk singer, and their father was a cantor in the Ashkenazi style. This was interesting because he had grown up in Iran, steeped in Persian music. As Danielle and Galeet say in their new podcast, The Nightingale of Iran, they didn't know a lot about their Persian heritage when they were growing up in America.
But what if I told you I found a time machine? Because I did.
The time machine Danielle found was a treasure trove of audio recordings. There were hundreds of them that her parents and grandparents had recorded from the 1960s up until the age of smartphones. Those recordings transported Galeet and Danielle into the past and into an exploration of their family's Persian Jewish musical legacy. The Dardashti's grandfather, Yunus Dardashti, was a superstar celebrity singer in Iran in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, with his own show on Iranian national radio. He and their grandmother moved to Israel in 1967, but for years he traveled back and forth to Iran so he could continue to perform for his fans. That ended with the Iranian Revolution in 1979, when most of Iran's Jews left the country. The Dardashti's father, Farid, also sang on television in Iran as a young man, before he immigrated to America in the 1960s, became a cantor, and married their mother, an Ashkenazi New Yorker. In this episode of Can We Talk, the Dardashti sisters discuss their family history during the Golden Age in Iran, when women and minorities thrived. They also talk about what it was like to uncover their family story through archival recordings, interviews with family members, and so much amazing music. Galeet is an anthropologist, musician, and composer. Danielle is a journalist and storyteller. They had already started doing interviews and research for the podcast when Danielle stumbled on the audio recordings in their parents' basement. So in terms of what's on them, a lot of these, from what I understand, are recordings that your father and his family sent back and forth when he was in the States and they were in Iran, and they just missed each other, and this was their way of reconnecting.
Yeah, it was like, these tapes are like 3 hours long each. So it'll be like our dad talking for an hour, telling them about everything in his life.
It's just amazing because they're having these whole long conversations and you know, very personal, and talking about their feelings and how they miss each other. And
just even mundane things like, oh, Farid and I got a telephone today. It's our very first telephone. And now we can call you from our, it's like,
these moments.
And our grandmother in Iran telling our dad, like, what color she painted the living room. And, she painted all the radiator covers a new, very chic kind of gold paint. It's just very, very, even like the mundane things are amazing.
Are just lovely to hear.
And also like sounds of birthday parties and Shabbat dinner.
And because our family's so musical, a lot of times singing for each other.
Tons of that.
It's like they knew that you would want to produce a podcast about them someday.
Right?
It's insane. But, and just, Nahanni, and just to give you a sense, these recordings weren't just cassette tapes. They were, these were cassette tapes, these really old reels that like we had never really seen.
We don't even know what they're called.
We got all the tapes converted to digital and started listening. Here's my mom and dad singing as a duo in New York in 1965 when they just started dating. And something I thought I'd never hear. Saba's radio show, just like it sounded on the air in 1963 Iran.
So let's talk about your grandfather, whose voice is in some of those tapes. What was your relationship like with him? What was he like as a grandfather?
So we always lived really far away. We lived in America and he lived in Israel for most of our time that he was alive. And we didn't speak the same language. He didn't speak English or Hebrew, and we didn't speak Persian.
When we heard his singing, I at that time I didn't know anything about Persian music. And so when I would hear him performing, it was very foreign. And so, he was this interesting famous person that when we would go to bar mitzvahs or weddings, people would beg him to sing, and we got a kick out of that. But we didn't ever we weren't able to speak with him actually. So it was like smiles and hugs, and hearing him sing this music that he was famous for that we really couldn't relate to.
So can you tell a couple of stories about his career in Iran? I mean, he was famous and beloved.
The most dramatic story about his career is the moment that he was discovered. And we actually didn't know the details of that story.
No, nobody did.
Because, you see, he didn't really talk about his own life.
He wasn't a talker. He wasn't a talker, Nahanni. He was a singer.
And this one tape where in that last year of his life where he told all those stories had been buried in the basement ever since 1991 when the tape was recorded. And so, no one had heard these stories since then. He was born sometime around 1899 in Tehran's Jewish ghetto, the Mahalleh, in Sarchal. It's a really amazing thing because he had a very rough childhood, grew up an orphan, and grew up with an uncle who he lived with who was very abusive and forbade him from singing. He grew up and married our grandmother. He was working at the Iranian National Railroad, in the office at the railroad. And one day when Iran had become a little bit of a different place than the Iran that he grew up in. Now they weren't living in the ghetto anymore. Jews were allowed out of the ghetto and living in integrated neighborhoods with Muslims. He was at a party mingling with Muslims, and there was a very famous female singer. Do you want to talk a little bit about Vaziri also, before we give away the moment?
She is kind of an amazing character because she was the first woman who was a famous singer in Iran. She was the first female star that Iran had. And
it was a huge deal because women were not. Yeah,
it was a huge deal, and she actually performed. She was the first person. She performed without a veil,
without a head covering.
Without a head covering, that is.
Here's that auspicious moment, reconstructed in the podcast using an archival recording of their grandfather and an interview with their father.
Suddenly, in the middle of that party, our grandfather says the power went out. It became quiet, and in the darkness, something inside him told him to sing. When the lights came back on, the famous singer Vaziri ran over to him.
He just wow, What a voice! I get goosebumps when I talk about that.
This is how Yunus Dardashti became known as the Nightingale of Iran, after the bird that sings in the dark.
She walked over to him and says, "Who are you? Why haven't I ever heard you? You're magnificent." So he said, "Well, I'm Jewish." He says, "Jewish? What does that mean? This is a new country now. Jewish, Christian, whatever you are. That voice, people have to hear that voice. They don't realize how good you are."
It's like a Cinderella kind of story, you know, and that's the moment that she discovered him.
Changed his life forever.
Yeah. Another interesting thing about Vaziri is that she's a Muslim woman, she was discovered by Mortazaneh Davood, who is the other Jewish Iranian, very famous musician. And it's interesting that then she went on to discover our grandfather.
And what do you think is significant about the fact that a Jew discovered her and then she discovered your grandfather? I mean, what does that say about what was happening in Iran at that time?
Well, I think that what was happening at that time is that more marginalized groups like Jews and women, they hadn't had an opportunity to shine before this period.
The period Galeet is referring to is from 1941 to 1979, when the Shah of Iran was in power.
Vaziri benefited from, Mohammad Reza Shah and his basically opening up Iran and wanting to kind of westernize Iran more, and he allowed these marginalized groups to thrive. And so she benefited from this, and she was raised up by a Jew. And, in turn, when she heard our grandfather and heard he was Jewish, she helped him. And it made sense for her because she, as a woman, had also been marginalized. So I think it's kind of a beautiful thing in that way that that she lifted him up just as she had been lifted up by a Jewish musician.
I was struck by how very different the Iran that you describe from your father's childhood is from the Iran that we hear about today in the news. I mean, you talk about your father singing on television in Hebrew. Can you describe what you know about the Iran that your father grew up in?
Oh, it was just so drastically different from from the way it is now, where it's so restrictive and people can't leave without, women can't leave without covering themselves up. Where minorities had rights, where music was for the first time, it was valorized.
But again, Nahanni, this was a blip in history. So it's not that this is the way it was, and then it wasn't that way after the Iranian Revolution in 1979. Up until the 1940s, it had never been this way. And then the new Shah, really changed Iran. And this was a very bizarre blip in time for Iran.
And also, you have to remember that, for religious Muslims, many of whom really hated the Shah, he also didn't allow Muslims to express their religiosity. So he tamped down on that too. I mean, it's a very, very complicated historical period. So Jews loved the Shah because for them, he opened everything up, but at the same time, he was really, pushing back the Islamicists. And so, at a certain point, they rebelled against that.
Galeet, you have dedicated your career to kind of reclaiming the culture of your grandfather. Can you talk about why that was necessary, why the musical legacy kind of got covered up and you had to rediscover it yourself?
Yeah, no, I mean, definitely my grandfather was the motivation for many aspects of my musical and academic career. first of all, a big piece of it is what we talk about in the podcast, that like we didn't grow up with a Persian identity. You know, we would connect with our grandparents and suddenly we'd be, we'd be in a very Persian world, and yet we didn't speak Persian and we weren't connected. So part of it was just wanting to reconnect with this piece of myself, and part of it was wanting to honor the legacy of my grandfather and to, to have other people understand in this country where it's so Ashkenazi focused, and that people don't really, for the most part, don't understand the history of Jews from the Middle East and North Africa here in the United States, and just, not understanding the way in which Jews and Muslims had this shared culture, and not understanding how different things were from now in our contemporary moment, the way Jews and Muslims are so separated, and it feels like that always was the case, and just wasn't.
Galeet's latest musical project is called Monajat. It's a collection of songs in which Galeet sings along with old recordings of her grandfather singing the Slichot prayers, the prayers of atonement leading up to the high holidays.
You sing these prayers to kind of get yourself in the mood for the the self-reflection, and there are these beautiful prayers that are sung every single night, sometime between like midnight and dawn. And being a cantor is not a profession in Iran. My grandfather would volunteer to lead the prayers of Slichot in Iran. And people have these amazing memories of him chanting these prayers. And so I basically reinvented the Slichot ritual, and I composed some pieces, and I sampled my grandfather's singing and, timed it so that I could kind of sing with him with this incredible ensemble of musicians. And in this way, I was able to basically dialogue with my grandfather musically. My grandfather ends the piece by singing this piece called Monajat, and it's completely in Persian. The word Monajat means fervent prayer in Persian. It was his thing. He would end Slichot prayers with this very Persian piece that was all about waking up to worship God. And it's very close to the kinds of poems of Rumi and Hafez that he would sing in Persian classical music. And yet he brings it into his Jewish ritual, which was completely natural for him because he so comfortably, swam in both ponds. It's been really exciting, both as an academic and as an artist, to be able to kind of connect with my grandfather musically in a way that I never was able to when he was alive, and to be able to actually sing with him, has been really exciting and powerful for me.
Danielle, what was it like for you personally to delve so deeply into your grandfather's story?
Man, it was unbelievable. I went deep, man. I mean, there were times that I was like living in 1963 Tehran through these tapes. I was like a fly on the wall in their home, in Iran now, and have celebrated holidays with them in Tehran and heard them singing songs as little boys. And, I mean, it's been a very, very interesting, amazing experience.
So I want to ask you a question about gender and family legacy. Your two sisters, and you have a third sister whose voice you hear on the podcast sometimes. And this story that you've created is mostly all about filling in the gaps in your knowledge about the men in your family, your father and grandfather. So what did it mean for both of you as women to be exploring this side of your family?
I think Galeet and Michelle and I have all been very privileged to not have a brother. And I don't mean that in a bad way.
That's exactly what I was going to say.
But I
Absolutely.
think we didn't know gender.
We didn't understand.
We didn't understand the limitations of gender in our family because our father treated us
like we could do anything.
Anything.
I feel the exact same way. I never reflected upon my gender at all. I didn't understand. I didn't feel like I was limited in any way at all. And actually, when I started performing sacred Middle Eastern and North African Jewish music, so many people said to me, wow, you as a woman performing this music. And I was very naive because we grew up in a very egalitarian and primarily Ashkenazi world. Our dad is kind of amazing, and our mom is amazing too. But, you would think that maybe because he's Iranian,
I think it would have been different if we had a brother.
It would have 100% been different.
If we had a brother, we would have really
there would have been more boundaries.
Felt our gender.
I agree. So we've come to realize that, I think, in the last 10 years more. I started reflecting much more on my gender after I became a mom. And when people reacted to my performing sacred music, which in the Sephardi Mizrahi world is performed by men, and people started commenting on it, and it was so powerful for so many women. But I actually wasn't trying to be provocative. For me, I grew up, our father was a cantor, so it seemed totally natural to be performing sacred music.
And it's interesting because our grandmother, on our Persian side, she got married when she was 14 years old.
Wow.
And
she had our dad when she was 16.
Yeah, our dad is the first of 5 kids, and she had him when she was 16. And so, at first you'd think like, oh, poor her and all that. But later in her life, she really became a leader, and you'll hear that in episode 5.
She was a very powerful
woman.
She went after what she wanted. She made things happen, and she's really the reason that our grandfather and the family moved to Israel. She raised money for the Persian synagogue and founded this synagogue in Rishon LeZion in Israel.
Episode 5 is called Safta's Dream. And it's really about her kind of going after her dream to move to Israel and bring the family there no matter what. No matter if her husband was a famous singer on the radio in Iran, no matter how good life had become for Jews in Iran at that time, she followed through on it and made it happen. And, so the women in our story, and our mom is a pretty amazing human being as well. And I wasn't kidding at the beginning of episode 4 when I said that if you asked our mom why we're all so un-Persian, she does say, "Oh, I had too much influence. It's all my fault." But she does have a lot of influence. And, when we had our family band, she was the one who decided the songs that we sang in our family band as, a 5-some.
Do you have any closing thoughts about the power of storytelling and family storytelling in particular?
It was really important to me to tell this family story. And I knew that it would resonate among Jews and among Iranians. But I had no idea. And I still don't know if we know fully.
No.
But we're getting emails and texts and messages on social media and everything from people all over the world who are affected by our story and see themselves and their families in our stories. People who have no connection to Judaism or Iran, but whose families are immigrants, whose families have intermarriage of all different kinds, or, who are mixed race, mixed religion, who see themselves in our story in so many different ways that I had never even imagined people would, because it's the same feelings of feeling like an outsider or feeling like you want to
assimilate,
fit in, and feeling, the feelings that we're describing are so universal.
Yeah.
It is really amazing how much our stories connect us emotionally.
That was Danielle and Galeet Dardashti talking about their new podcast, The Nightingale of Iran, which you'll find at nightingaleofiran.com. Stick around to the end of the credits for a special treat in honor of Purim, which is just around the corner. Thank you for joining us for Can We Talk, the podcast of the Jewish Women's Archive. Our team includes Jen Richler and Judith Rosenbaum. Our theme music is by Girls in Trouble. You also heard songs from Galeet Dardashti's recent album Monajat, including Melech, in which she sings along with recordings of her grandfather, Yunus Dardashti. Melech is the theme music for The Nightingale of Iran. You can find Can We Talk online at jwa.org/canwetalk, or anywhere you get your podcasts. This episode was sponsored by the Jewish Publication Society, which has just released the first Jewish gender-sensitive translation of the full Hebrew Bible. The JPS Tanakh Gender-Sensitive Edition revises the iconic 1985 JPS translation to reflect advances in scholarship and changes in English, while remaining true to the original Hebrew. Learn more and order with special discounts at jps.org. Now, to get us in the mood for Purim, let's hear Galeet and her father Farid Dardashti chanting from the book of Esther.
ויספר המן לזרש אשתו ולכל אוהביו את כל אשר קראו ויאמרו לו חכמיו וזרש אשתו אם מזרע היהודי מרדכי אשר חילותה לנפול לפניו לא תוכל לו כי נפל תיפול לפניו. עודם מדברים עמו וסריסי המלך הגיעו ויבהילו להביא את המן אל המשתה אשר עשתה אסתר.
Chag Purim Sameach. I'm Nahanni Rouse. Until next time.